to get you in the middle of harvest. I know things are a little bit crazy, right?
Well, no, I mean, we're starting to get fruit from Heathcote on Tuesday and Wednesday, but our stuff's still 5 weeks away. So we did a bottling yesterday. We bottled some of the 2021. So we've been busy with nets, with getting ready for bottling, doing the bottling, but we're not crazy yet. We're sort of on the way to crazy.
Well, I'll be sure not to bother you in the next couple of weeks.
And Michael, does this China stuff affect you at all? Do you do much into China?
No, Lou, we do about 1% or half of 1% of our wine into China. We've never pursued it, and we've only ever sold bits and pieces to people just as a sort of a deal here, one-off, every now and again when they've got a good story, the right hotel or the right little restaurant group or the angle. But we've said no over many years, and we never had any inclination to get involved. I just don't understand the market. I don't understand the wine culture there. The volatility, which obviously we've seen now brought to bear with the government. So it's just never looked like a stable, market that makes sense to us. I think if we had bigger production, people running around doing more things, then okay, it would have, been an opportunity. But for us, it just didn't make sense for us. It's sweat.
Hey, Greg, while I've got you, is it affecting many of the things that you're dealing with?
We're very lucky. We got paid 2 weeks before all the turmoil. So there are a couple of people who got wine in prior to everything happening, but so yeah, there is some impact. Some groups who were doing very well are being impacted on, and particularly, a lot of the wines were going to fine in restaurants. So, for example, the Park Hyatt, Grand Hyatt, and Shanghai were pouring a lot of wines that we were, sending into the market. But what's happened is that they've closed anyway, so there's no one there. So the impact probably would have happened anyway, despite the tariff. One thing we're noticing is that some people who focused on that market, there's a bit more wine than there would have been. And we think that's positive, given, it's given us some opportunities that we wouldn't have had before. And we gleefully put our hand up to take some of the quality wines that are available that aren't going to that market. And, like if you want to know markets that are booming, you look at places like South Korea, for example. It's unbelievably strong right now for Australia and growing at a rate. The other one's Taiwan is growing also. So there are, even when you look at the stats, even the Canadian market's growing for Australia. So there are a lot of markets that are growing, and Singapore's incredibly strong, as you know. So there are, so the impact is, we were about a bit more than Michael. We were about 8% was China for us, but we found other homes for the wine.
Fair enough. All right, Rob, over to you, mate.
Right. Mike, thanks for joining us again tonight. I think this is a take two of our last discussions the last time when we were talking about how amazingly good the Costas looks, particularly as it gets to a little bit of bottle age. And also you were talking about how interesting it is to see Costas in this particular stage, because the vines are evolving into something really, really very interesting at this stage in the vine life. So thank you for agreeing to come back and have a look at these three tonight. Guys, if you haven't seen the group chat, we're starting with the younger, the 18, and then ending with the 15. It just, looking at it this morning, it just seemed to make more sense to do it that way. So, Mark, if I've got it right, the things that define Costas is certainly an innate minerality, a suppleness, a sort of taunt kind of athleticism in the wine, particularly at a younger stage. And the length is something which has always been impressive, even more so for me personally. At the younger stage, the length of the Costas is more impressive even than the Quartz. It just seems to present really, just in a more fuller context at an earlier stage. Of course, they go in different directions as they get older. But would that possibly be the right way to define them as a label?
Yeah, I think Costas always seems to be closer to its best when it's young than the Quartz is. I think the Quartz takes time to get to its best, and I think ultimately, what its best is. But to me, the Quartz takes 4, 5, 6, 7 years, depending on the year, to really arrive where it's super expressive with the power. Early days, it can be a bit shut down, and you can have to go searching for some of the nuances in the wine. Whereas Costas has always got this brightness and freshness and vigor, where Quartz can look a bit sort of dense and closed down.
It has the sense of being compact at its early stage. I remember when I first started drinking your wines, of course, they're so incredibly famous. And I used to taste these Quartzes maybe 18 months after release and think, I'm not, obviously just hadn't had the benefit of time. I wasn't seeing the glory that it moves to as it gets older. That's for sure.
Yeah, I think generally Quartz is like 5, 7 years. But the beauty with Costas is that it has this sort of interplay of bright citric fruit and floral characteristics and lots of bright acidity and sort of real vigor and freshness.
Yeah.
And it's a Chardonnay a lot of people who don't like Chardonnay can actually enjoy. Often people say, oh, no, I don't like Chardonnay. It's too oaky, it's too woody, it's got too much butterscotch and creaminess. Yeah. And we give them Costas and they go, oh, I love this wine. It's fresh and alive and it's got these sort of citric, almost Riesling-like aromatics, white flowers and jasmine notes and this sort of thing, particularly when it's young. But Costas is interesting because it's the lower down soils of our Chardonnay blocks. And so it's volcanic soil over clay versus Quartz, which is much more mudstone, sandstone, quartz rock and clay. And this volcanic soil, 5 million year old volcanic soil in the Costas, tends to give slightly more vigorous vines, which have a slightly larger crop load and more leaf. And the fruit stays more varietal Chardonnay regional Macedon ranges where at high altitude, slow ripening, and shows all those details in the wine. Whereas with Quartz, the soil is so strong and the yields are small, the berries are small, that it's more about the vineyard site in Quartz. There's this sort of power which is about other things than Chardonnay and climate, but it's really the vineyard site speaks very strongly and doesn't let the variety show as strongly. But Costas does, like it really shows the altitude, it shows the brightness of this cold climate, slow ripening. And then of course, the vines are now 30, well in the 18, they're 30 years old. And you start to have the benefit in the winery of being able to be pretty sort of loose with the wine. I mean, we don't manipulate this wine very much at all. It gets a little bit of sulfur through its life, and that's it. There's no acid add, there's no enzymes or nutrients or yeast or fining agents. It's just got this really great resilience. So we just bring the fruit in and press it and put it into barrel. There's no settling in tank or anything. It goes straight to barrel, 100% solid, and it ferments on ambient yeast. And because the soil is so healthy with no herbicides or pesticides or systemic sprays, the yeast population and nutrients are so vigorous that the wine just takes off and ferments cleanly without the need for nutrients. So it's a really great fortune of soil profile, of vine age, and the husbandry of the viticulture to give the chance for the fruit to do so well.
It's just looking at the three altogether, the phenolics of the three, I find the 18 and the 15 seem to speak the same lemon characteristic. Obviously, the 15 is going into more of a marmalade-y component now with the age, whereas the 16 has a very unique phenolic that's different from the other two, and probably more floral is probably where I'd stick my, if I had to put a thumbtack into it. I'd say that's possibly speaking more of the floral, and the other two are speaking more of the lime citrus at this stage.
Yeah, it's a great call. And I think what you're picking up on there is the variation in vintage. And 15 and 18 have many similarities in that they were very even seasons, very strong vines. Everything sort of went very smoothly. There was no great challenge in either of those 2 years. They kind of almost dial it up benchmark years. Yeah. Whereas 16...
Kind of like siblings, whereas 16 is slightly different.
Well, it was a drought year, or at least it was a very dry year. And my concern when we got to harvest was, would the wines, both Pinot and Chardonnay, have enough freshness and vitality, a little bit like 2007. And thankfully, the beautiful thing with hindsight of having done so many vintages now is you get a year like 16, and because we've seen some of these warmer years before, and know the wines still maintain freshness and detail and vibrancy, it's like, okay, everything will be okay. And 16 was still, you have this slight nervousness or this want for the wines to be as good as they can be in the style we like. And I was a little bit concerned about 16 with that warmth. And then as the wines got bottled up and hit the market, people were going, oh, what beautiful freshness and vitality and talky characteristics and jasmine notes, that sort of thing, which was just a huge relief to know that the altitude and the soil and the way we process the fruit and look after it in the winery still translates to the style we like, even with that sort of warmer, more difficult year. And the Pinots speak that same way as this Costas does, with that energy through it. But a lot of the energy is more reliant on tannin structure from those nice ripe skins in a drier year than the higher levels of acidity we'd see in other years. So you get that length and you get that dryness and you get that energy in the wine, but there's a slight increase in it being done by skins or tannin than acid in a year like 16.
Gotcha. Yeah. What's really cool about doing these sort of verticals is there's no doubt that it's from the same place. It's made by the same person. There's a certain characteristic about the wine that definitely binds them together, notwithstanding the various vintages. This is definitely made by you, and I really love to see that, because sometimes we'll do verticals in some wineries with some labels and they're all over the place. Whereas here there's a firm stamp of place.
Really, I mean, it's really important. That's the blessing of a good vineyard site and looking after it well. But I take my mind back 30 years ago to when I first started making wine alongside Stuart Anderson, who really taught me how to make wine. And 91 was the first vintage I worked with Stuart. And one of the greatest lessons he gave was, every year you need to make a beautiful wine. And some years will be great years, and some years you'll have to struggle and you'll have to work so hard in the vineyard and be, really interpretive in the winery to make sure everything that it can elevate that wine to be as good as it can be is done. But that's the requirement, that every year we have to make something delicious. And then, once it fits in that box, then the year and the stamp and all the stylization can be there. But you have to get it into that place by doing all those things. And then they are what they are, the expression of the.
I think the sort of money shot for me in the 15 is this sappiness or oiliness. It has this beautiful sort of fat plumpness that counteracts against wonderful acidic. So you're getting this really beautiful balance. Whereas often in a Chardonnay, one of those two things are out of whack. I think of some of the old Mudgee Chardonnays and what have you. It was just all huge fat, exuberance, but not the kind of acids that you have here from these sites. It's really great to see it in juxtaposition like this.
Yeah, Robert, we've had this thing in Australia, and I think probably in some other parts of the world, but particularly here, where the pendulum sort of swung one way 20 years ago, 30 years ago, too far to that really heavy, oaky, malolactic, kind of low acid, very unctuous creme caramel kind of Chardonnay. And fair enough too, it swung back, but went too far. And I think probably 8-10 years ago, we saw a lot of really lean, green, mean Chardonnays that were trying to capture some of the attention that was being given to Sauvignon Blanc. And I don't think good Chardonnay ever needs to be either of those two things. When it's picked right in the good moment, in the right area, right climate, it's very forgiving. You can do it in tank with lees, you can do it in barrels, new or old. But if you get that picking time right with the balance in the fruit, it's pretty forgiving, and you can make this bright, beautiful wine which shows a little bit more richness, yes, or a little bit more oak and influence of spice, yes. But if you get that picking decision right in, say, in Victoria, in Mornington or Yarra or Macedon or Geelong, you can really get it into that place where it keeps that freshness with texture.
Really interesting. I was thinking, looking back at the notes from when we spoke last year, and there was something that I picked up when we tasted Kosta's. I can't recall the vintage we had last time, but there was like a lemon lime. There was like a green citrus aspect to it. And I see it to a certain degree in 18, but not so much in the 16 and 15s tonight. The 15 probably because it's getting to that second tier now where it's going towards the caramel marmalade components. But I really like that stamp. Is that something that prevails often in your releases?
It certainly is something that we see here, but I see it in lots of good Chardonnays. When I drink some great young Chardonnays from France, even in New Zealand, and sometimes in cooler parts of California or Oregon, you can see what I like to think of as lemonade character in Chardonnay when they're young. You know, when they're in the first sort of 24 months of harvest. You see this brightness and this pithiness. So it's like, is it grapefruit? Is it lime? Is it lemon? Is it touching, you know, if it's a bit riper, a bit more exotic, it might touch kumquat with some of those flavors. But it does those things. And I reckon it's a really good sign when you see something that's been in barrel for a year on solids, fermented, and it can come out bright and expressive like that with such purity. And often those wines can be handled quite oxidatively. Like we don't use inert gases when we're pressing, or you know, we're not just focus solely on protecting the wine. We actually quite like it to oxidize the solids out. But what you find still after 12 months is when that wine goes into bottle, there's all this brightness and life because it's so resilient. But I love those characters.
And it seems to endure. It seems to be something that stays with the wine even through its maturation process, which is just so good to see.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, Mike, I was interested to, you know, I very often lose track of pricing of wines. And so I was setting this all up today. And I went back and checked my notes several times, and both the labels were 75 Sing dollars. And I can think of a lot of Chardonnays a lot more expensive than $75, particularly from the Southern Hemisphere, that are not even close to the quality that you're representing here. I sent a note through to Greg to particularly see what he had left of 15 back in Australia, because I just think at that sort of price point with this sort of cellaring quality, it's extraordinarily good. I'm so jazzed to taste them tonight.
That's lovely to hear. It's a funny one, pricing. It's a really awkward one because some of our wines are what I would say, you know, quite expensive, and I think they still offer value there. But I think the Kostas is the best value wine from.
Undoubtedly.
And then it's not a cheap wine, you know. It's not a sort of giveaway price. And it's interesting because with the Quartz, you know, it's just a smaller area, and the market has kind of pushed the price there. But the Quartz might be 200 dozen a year, and the Kostas Rind 400 or 500 dozen a year. So it's not as though we're making 5,000 cases of the Kostas Rind, you know, and it's everywhere. So therefore, there's pressure down on the price. No, and it sells out really well. I think that it's actually lovely to have a wine in our portfolio that is not, you know, excessively or outrageously or just a high price. And we've started playing around under a little separate label called Dhillon, and there's the Perret Shiraz that we do as well. And there's little parcels of things, and we keep thinking, let's not make them too expensive. They just don't, you know, it's just nice to have something, even if it's tiny volumes, that our family and friends who are not all extravagant wine collectors and buyers go, you know, $40, $45, that's good. I can spend that. I'm happy to do that. I mean, I always like to find a delicious wine, whether it's a Bourgogne Rouge or Blanc, or a friend from Mornington's Chardonnay or Pinot that's, you know, around that price. And I go, well, that's good. I'm happy to drink that and share that around without thinking, oh, God, you know, everyone needs to pay attention. It's a $100 bottle of wine or a $200 bottle of wine.
Well, I'm just seeing in the shishia parts of New Zealand in particular now, where it's very small production and the ratings, etc., are pushing it up. The cost of wine of this quality is at least $100, north of $100 in New Zealand. There's definitely a pricing benefit to what you're releasing under Kostas. I think you always have, but it's more so obviously now looking at that vintage to see just how good it is. At a later stage with a bit of extra time.
I think. I mean, we've done 30 vintages, and the 31st vintage is on the vine of fruit from these vines, just 40 to 30 meters from where I'm sitting now. And we have confidence now in the wines, how well they mature, the right way of going about the viticulture and the winemaking, and we have confidence that all the wines, Block 5, Original Vineyard, Quartz, Kosta, sit in their place. And for us as a family, the whole mix works. We don't have to charge $120 for every bottle of wine that comes from Bindi. We can have some at this level, some at that level. There's arguments about where the right quality or the right price is. But as long as that mix works for us, and you've got to be careful not to underprice your wine, because then you don't often garner enough respect, or people say, why can't you command more for it? Aren't you successful enough? Yeah. And we feel we've got these other wines that really make that statement internationally for us in a really strong way and get put in all the tastings. And then this wine is something like we say to our friends and family, this is the wine to buy. Like this is the wine that's really good price and delicious. And unless you're a real connoisseur and can pick the difference between Quartz and Kostas, or wait the 7 years for the best things to happen, why bother?
Yeah, exactly. The question from Lou on production of Kostas, I think it's 300 to 500 D a year, depending on vintage.
Yeah, 400 or 500. A really big year might go north of 500. We just bottled yesterday the 2020, and there were 240 dozen. Like, it's really low. 2020 is a tiny production, unfortunately. But I think what's on the vine this year would probably make about 500 dozen.
Okay, so it's looking good. I think Giant Steps on Thursday were saying the same things with their 20s. It's a fraction of normal production levels.
It was a tough year. I mean, it was our 30th vintage, and we were really hoping for something that was a great celebration and amazing year, and we'd have all our family and friends around, and we'd have a great time over harvest. Instead, we had the most difficult summer to run and make wine, and then we got shut down with COVID. Just as we got towards harvest. So there was no one around. It was minimum crew. There was no celebrations. There was no great long lunches or dinners. It was just quite bizarre.
I think you should just quietly move your 30th to 21 and call it a day.
Say I think so. Well, all things going smoothly. Who knows?
There's a note that's just come in. We've got 5 dozen of the 15 Kostas still available at the original price of 75. So
you've got more than me. We've got 2 dozen.
All right, let's move on to the Pinots now. So larger production, 500 to 800 a year. Yeah. And what I didn't actually know, Mike, was that this is declassified original vineyard fruit. That piece of info I'd never come across before. I thought it was actually a singular vineyard.
Yeah, well, it's the original vineyard planted in 1988 has a couple of different clones, and it's the quartzy soil that then swings down onto the volcanic soil. So it's sort of the area of that planting from 1988 that we don't use for the original vineyard, that we keep aside for the Dixon. It's the sort of the most fruity area.
So you're not taking specific fruit off the vines and saying original Dixon. It's actually an area in the vineyard. Okay.
Yeah, it's a part. Yeah, it's a part of the vineyard down there, and then the rest of it is from the K vineyard planted in 2001, so 20 years old now. Yeah, and the K vineyard is all on grafted vines, and there's areas within the K vineyard where they tend to produce higher yields, and that's where their balance is. So the parts of the K vineyard that produce the lower cropping vines and loads, we keep for the K wine, which we age for 3 or 4 years before release. Maybe make about 120 dozen generally. And the more fruit forward parts of that block, the higher yielding areas, we use with that declassified original vineyard, which is about 200 meters away. And that's so there's about 200 meters between those two areas.
Got it. All right, let's have a sniff. So that's what blew my mind away, was it clearly has a different characteristic from original Pinot. There's certainly on the phenolics, just looking at it again now, there's definitely an increased sort of fleshiness to the nose, a more dark berry kind of component to the nose, whereas the original doesn't give me quite that sort of wild sort of mulberry kind of thing, which I'm certainly getting off this today.
The original vineyard is the most perfumed we make. It's got these red cherries and raspberry, and sometimes a bit of strawberry, but more sort of raspberry, red cherry. Whereas the Dixon with these two components has this more boisterous fruit character. I kind of see the picture of the wine, whereas I see original vineyard having this sort of perfume, flow and line and length, whereas
Right.
the Dixon is this sort of more flamboyant, rounded, juicier style of Pinot. I mean, it depends
Right.
on the year. Like the 2020 we just bottled is a bit tighter and
Yeah.
not as voluptuous or juicy as the
Yeah.
19 or even the 16. And that's the vintage thing. But for sure, whenever we taste at the winery, the Dixon is always the most fruit forward, the most supple. And it ages particularly well. We've been trying the 08, 09 and 10 recently in the last sort of 4 or 5 months. And at 10 years of age, the wine is quite beautiful. Like, it really sits in a good spot. But it kind of drinks well from any stage, really. There's never a sort of moment it's not drinking well. It's young and fruity.
I'd say curiously again, the middle wine is a different from the other two. So 16 and 18 seem to echo the same kind of phenolics, whereas 17 is more of a lighter red fruit or cherry kind of nose.
Yes.
It's really cool to see that differential again.
Yeah, I agree, Rob. Spot on.
And 17 was a really cool year. 16 was, 16 and 17 are a massive contrast. 16 was a couple of weeks earlier in harvest, but certainly a much, much warmer summer. And 17 was this long, slow, cold, ripening period. And you see all that sort of prettiness and fineness and tangy acidity in 17 compared to this.
Super interesting because it even speaks into the texture, Mike. The texture itself is a little more glossy, or I don't know if that's the right word, a bit more crunchy than the other two. It definitely stands out, and it really has its own story to tell. I really love it. It's for me, that style really is something that I love to find.
When I think about those two wines, I think about getting a nice blood plum, and the 16 is when the plum is really perfectly fully ripe, and you've had it for a day or two, and then you eat it, and it's got that richness and sweetness and fullness. Whereas the 17 is like picking the plum and eating it a day early, and you can tell it's ripe, and you want to eat it because you're hungry and you want to try that plum.
You want it,
but it's still got that crunchy, bracing character in there.
Yeah. Sam's saying he's picking up barbecue. Sam, I'd say on the 16, or is that what you're referring to? The charcuterie kind of thing? Yeah, 16. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So a bit of age, bit of earthiness, a bit more gaminess. So it's interesting, that conversation, Sam, about Pinot Noir, where I think in the formative days in Australia, so 25, 30, 35 years ago, there was this thinking that having the secondary complexities arriving in Pinot Noir quite early was really advantageous, that you were getting those undergrowth, forest floor, Burgundian characteristics. And we've always just wanted to have really pure Pinot Noirs when they're young and bottled up. And then as different wines age, whether it's at 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, or 10 years of age, those secondary characteristics from bottle aging
they'll naturally occur, right?
Yeah, so that wine's nearly, the 16 is just about 5 years. It's probably about 5 or 6 weeks away from being 5 years since it came off the vine and started getting made to wine. And that's for Dixon probably maybe a year or two earlier, because it was a warmer year. So I think in the 17 and 18, you'd probably wait till the wine's 6 or 7 years of age to see those characteristics come in more. And then, to my mind, they're really valid characteristics in Pinot, because they've come through bottle age, where you've got that complexity, but you've also got fruit purity running alongside it.
And more importantly than anything, Michael, it's naturally occurring, as opposed to engineering something at an earlier stage. And it's really hits the nail on the head. Every time people try to engineer something to an end result, it ends in tears in wine game, and particularly in the Pinot side of the business. I get a note from Greg, we've got 20 bottles left in Australia of the 16s. I'll send everybody a note probably tomorrow morning, just with what's available, because it's definitely not all on the site. We have very little of these back vintages on the site at present. I think there's plenty of the 17 and 18 Pinot still that we've got in Singapore. Any idea on cellaring, Michael? Would you have an idea on where you'd say that 16 right now represents a well-matured, ready-to-drink wine at 5 years?
Yeah, I think, well, what I've found over the years, what we've found is that the wines get up onto a plateau and there for quite a while. You know, when we first started producing Pinot Noir in 1992, we would say, well, it goes up and then it goes over, and so you've got to capture it on this sort of top of the curve as best you can. What we found with just having multiple vintages in bottle and looking at them over a decade is they go up and then they sit on a plateau for quite a while, just staying as a sort of medium mature wine, and then they slowly sort of taper off in fruit richness and brightness, and then just sort of linger on. So even like this particular wine going back to say 05, 06, they're actually delicious wines still, but they're not as fruit pure. But they're not brown, they're not old, they're not lacking fruit definition. But my feeling is the warmer years get there at about 5 or 6 years of age, and then are at their best for the next 5 or 6 years. The really classic years, like a 15 or a 10, take about 6 or 7 years to get to that full sort of on the plateau stage, and then seem to hang out there for about that same again. So everything's sort of a bit elongated the final year.
Yeah. And then finally, our last wine, the 18. Now, I think this is the first time I'm tasting the 18, Dixon. I don't think I've had a chance to taste it before. Lou, have you seen it before?
This is the 19, I think, Rob.
Of the Dixon, sorry, 19.
I haven't tasted it before, no, it's first time.
Okay.
It's a pretty flamboyant year, 19. Like 19 in Southern Victoria is one of the great years, strangely enough, for Pinot Noir. It was a really weird summer in that we had this sort of up and down time. We had a cold period to start with and dry, and then we had really good rain and warmth, and the vines grew strongly and really built up where we were quite nervous in the early summer. And then we had the driest summer on record, and so then we became very nervous about what's going to continue on. Is it going to be stress? Is it going to be a heat wave continuing? But thankfully, we had these strong vines from this wet and warm into spring.
But Michael, there's more echoes of 16 in the 19 than there is of 17.
But well, what was weird though was then it really cooled off. Like March was really cold, and in 19, where we'd normally pick over a week to get everything off around the vineyards, it took 17 days because it just got so cool, and everything just sort of staggered along slowly. So what you'll find in 19 is that richness of 16 and that fullness of 16, but there's more complexity and brightness and layering of fruit in the wines. And I recommend you have a look at a whole lot of other people's 19s from Southern Victoria, humble producers, great producers, because there's a lot of really good Pinot Noir in the cooler areas, particularly in Masterclass.
We haven't seen many bad ones, that's for sure.
Yeah, I reckon 19 is a real sure bet, particularly for those cooler areas like Macedon, Upper Yarra. There's some really, really good 19 Pinots. So I think the 19 Dixon has just got all this flamboyance. Like it's just got a lot of wine in the glass. Yeah.
There's also there's a component of slate or granite in it, which it's just quite interesting to know. It's something I haven't seen in your wine before. There's definitely a minerality component to it that I haven't recognized before. Dave just reminds me that we did the 16 Dixon at a Pinot tasting.
Yeah, we did. That's right.
And it was wine of the night. We did it against a bunch of Australian and French and
South African. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
It's nice.
And it snuck up on us and took the award for the wine of the night. It was great. I remember that.
It was about a year ago.
It was our very last tasting before Circuit Breaker. I think they shut us down the very next week. So it's almost to the day. It was a year ago. That's exactly.
Yeah.
Glad it showed well. That's good to hear.
Yeah. No, it was great. Sam, you're right. That 17 totally different profile. You're right about that musk. There's definitely an incense or musk kind of component to it, and again differentiates itself from the other two.
Yeah, there's some good descriptors coming across for sure. Yeah, that muskiness, I like it. I like that sort of.
Yeah, definitely.
That's a very Macedon Ranges Pinot Noir, particularly MV6 clone, has that muskiness in there.
Oh, is it really attributed to that particular clone? Is that what?
Yeah, it does show that pretty well, I reckon. Yeah.
Cool. Any more questions from anybody before we? Where's the clone from?
Well, it came out with James Busby about 1820.
God.
So it's reputed to come from Clos de Vougeot,
Right.
which that doesn't really mean a whole lot, does it? Because you go to Clos de Vougeot and have a look at the vines there, and there'll be one that's virus, one that's not virus, one with a big bunch, one with a small bunch, one with a wing, one without a wing, one that sets two bunches, one that sets one.
God love the French.
It's like the Abel clone in New Zealand. The gumboot clone that came from Romani Conti. Well, there's not just one clone or one type of Pinot Noir vine growing in Romani Conti. There's many. But it just so happened that it is a very small bunch, small berry, low yielding clone. We had Frederick Munier from Chambord-Mazzini here about 10 years ago, just before the harvest, and we were looking at the vineyard of different clones. And he said he'd been involved in an exercise looking over 4 hectares, so therefore studying 40,000 individual vines to identify the vines with the best balance for small bunches, small berries, great balance of canopy and quality. And he thought that MV6 would be in the top 5 clones or 5 examples that they saw. So it was just very fortuitous that nearly 200 years ago, Busby brought out this particular clone that does those things. It could
those
have been
kind of things.
something else.
Michael, there's a question in private chat about do you have a favorite clone? Is there
favorite clone? I think it has to be MV6 really, which we started with in 1988. And the new vineyards that we've planted in the last few years are half MV6, and then we have 5 or 6 or 7 other clones. But of those other clones, there's one called Pommard D4V2, which is really good. It's a really good clone. It sets a similar size bunch to MV6 and has similar characteristics, perhaps not so musky and a bit more earthy, but a really beautiful purity. So I'm very impressed with that. And the other thing we've been using here for about 20 years now with success is Dijon 115, which in warmer areas can advance a bit early, not as much as 114, but 115 in a cool area, high altitude with the right soils like this.
The Centro Toggans use that a lot.
Beautiful line and length, lovely fruit purity, nice and spicy. At Bindi, the 115 works really well.
And then a question about new projects. Are there new things coming up we don't know about? I know you spoke about Dhillon earlier. Yeah, the Dhillon label is just a bit of a fun and games kind of thing we're doing. At the moment, we've got some stuff from Heathcote. We bottled a little Grenache yesterday, and we made some rosé from Grenache last year, which it was only 70 dozen, and it's sold in about 5 days to a few restaurants and private clients. But we're going to make more of that this year, which is a ton of fun, and it's just a gently pink onion skin rosé, not much color. Highly aromatic, but just not too fruity and dry. Like barrel fermented, 6 months in old barrels, so it's completely dry, nice and textured, a bit chalky. That's fun. We've also got the 2 new high density vineyards, Darshan and Block 8, that we've made 4, soon to be 5 vintages from. But we're still 2 years away from releasing those wines. There's no hurry. They're really, really exciting vineyards, very intense, complex wines, as good as Block 5 from the bottlings that we've done so far. So we'll just wait and see, make a couple more vintages and then start to release. Well, maybe we can persuade you to send some of that rosé our way, because this is a land of rosé. There's no question about it. It's the climate makes sense. The food with the spice and the aromatics, that makes sense. And we do a massive amount of Turkey Flat Grenache rosé. So our clients already are big fans of the Grenache component. Another question from Dave. Do you have a clone program when you're trying to evolve clones like NV6 and Dijon? No, we don't. And there is interesting question. And there's often talk about Pinot Noir, how it's unstable and it mutates and so forth. We've been growing it here for 33 years now, and we still see the same vine structure and bunch structure in each clone and each block. I'm really not sure how long it takes for a Pinot Noir vine to mutate, or maybe one will here and there, and you've got to be really attentive and see that one go. But at the moment, we see within our blocks and the clones a lot of stability, really. But it's a pretty short time frame. Like 33 years sounds like a bit to me, because I'm 52. In vine terms, it's not a long time. Got to say that after 14 months in lockdown, I'm starting to mutate. and not in a good direction.
Gosh. That
Mike,
long.
thank you. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. It's been fantastic to have you over. Hope to see you again soon, and maybe we can taste some of those Dhillons next time.
That'll be good fun. Thank you to everyone for joining in, and
Thank you.
Robert and Lou and Greg, thanks so much for organising. Really appreciate it.
Very cool. Thanks, mate.
Pleasure.
Very
See
informative.
you again. Good luck with the rest of the
Bye-bye.
harvest. Take it easy.
Bye.
See ya.
I'm out here. See ya. Thank you.
See ya.